like to welcome you back to our podcast. We're studying through the book of Second Corinthians. Today we're in Second Corinthians, the 11th chapter, and we're going to be starting with verse number 18. So get your Bibles out if you can and read along with us. Otherwise, just listen to what we're going to say. The Apostle Paul is using a form of teaching called rhetoric. And again, let me just say this. There's a difference between sarcasm and rhetoric. Sarcasm is always meant to destroy, always meant to tear down. Rhetoric is meant to teach and to build up. And so Paul says in verse number 17, he says, what am I saying? Am I not saying as the Lord would? In other words, the Lord wouldn't use rhetoric, but he said, I'm using it. But as in foolishness, in other words, he's saying, I'm fitting into your culture. You know, anyone who's ever been a missionary like my wife and I, one of the important things is that you fit into the culture. And so Paul is fitting into the culture, and he says, but as in foolishness, and then he says, in this confidence of boasting. The Apostle Paul is again saying, I'm fitting into the culture. I know that I'm getting through to you there in Corinth. And then he says, and then we pick up in verse number 18, since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast also. Do you know these people that were out there and they were servants of righteousness, but really they were servants of Satan? What were they doing? They were saying, look at me. Look how holy I am. Look how good I am. And so Paul says, you know what? They're boasting according to the flesh. They're boasting in what they've done. And then Paul adds in verse number 18, he adds this, I will also. I'm going to boast in what God has done. I'm going to boast what God has done in the lives of people. I'm going to boast about what I have done as a minister of God, as a minister of true righteousness. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to bring it out. I am going to let people know what I have done, what God has done through me. And so the Apostle Paul says, I will boast also. And then we move on to verse number 19, and he says, for you being so wise. Now, maybe he's being a little sarcastic there, but you know what? He is getting to the point. You see, the Corinthians thought they were so wise, and they put so much emphasis on worldly wisdom, all these philosophies and all these ideologies, and they put so much emphasis on that. So Paul comes right out and says, for you, the Corinthians, and you, some of you here in the United States, some of you here in the world at this time, and you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly. In other words, what's Paul saying? He's saying, you're being wise. You think you're so wise, but yet you're putting up with those who are foolish. The word tolerate actually means to hold up or to back without failing. You're holding up these guys, these servants of Satan that make themselves out to be servants of righteousness. You're holding them up. You're supporting them. You're behind them. You're tolerating them. There were many Corinthians that were holding up and keeping to the failure of the false apostles. They were, even though these apostles were speaking things that weren't right, that weren't really godly in God's eyes, there were Corinthians still in the church that were backing these false apostles. And again, the Apostle Paul here is talking about false apostles. He's talking about false teachers, false leaders in the church. And he's saying to the Corinthians, there's some of you that are still backing them up. You're still tolerating them. And then he goes on And he says this, verse number 20, for you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you. What are these false prophets doing? They're enslaving them. They're saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. I remember being in churches that had so many rules. One church I went to many, many years ago, you can't wear deodorant. Men cannot wear any jewelry. Men can't do this and women can't do that. Women have to be silent in the church. Woo, now I said it. And what's Paul saying? You're enslaved. You're allowing these people to enslave you. But then he goes on and he says, and devour you and eat you up, who take stuff away from you. You're tolerating them. You're putting up with them. You're backing them. You're backing these people that enslave you. You're backing these people that are devouring you. And then he says, and anyone who takes advantage of you, you are backing these false teachers. And what are they doing? They're coming in, they're enslaving you, they're putting you into bondage. They're in there and they're devouring you. By the way, Paul is giving us several signs of what a false apostle looks like. A false apostle enslaves people. A false leader devours people, just constantly pulling away from people, taking what's not what he doesn't deserve or what she doesn't deserve. Anyone who takes advantage, always taking advantage of you, always looking and saying, I've got to be on the top. I've got to be the one at the top of everything. To take advantage means to take in whatever manner, to take. And Paul is saying that's a sign of a false apostle. And then he says, anyone exalts himself. You know what? A false leader, a false apostle will always raise himself up. They will not tolerate anything that tries to put them in their place. So he says they are false apostles, and you're there and you're tolerating them, you're lifting them up, you're backing them, and then the last thing that he says, anyone who hits you in the face. Whoa. Now, we need to understand that this was one of the most insulting things that could possibly happen to a person. If another person would slap you, you know what? It was an insult, the greatest of insults. And so what's Paul saying? Paul's saying these false apostles come in, and one of the things is they're always insulting you. They're always slapping you in the face, saying, what's wrong with you? The word slap here, actually the Greek word means to flay. It means to not just touch a little bit, but to really haul off and hit you hard. It's a very violent term. And it was the greatest of insults in the Corinthian culture. So the Apostle Paul makes it very evident that he's speaking to people. And he's speaking of the false apostles that have come into the church in Corinth. Now join us again tomorrow as we continue our study in the book of 2 Corinthians.